We are looking at how February storms are helping California's drought. I'm ABC 10 Chief Meteorologist Monica Woods, and we saw some great gains come in just a short period of time. This beautiful picture is at Donner Lake. That's along I-80. It is just off to the west of Lake Tahoe. That's coming in from one of our ABC 10 Weather Force members, Mendy Onsterman. So thank you so much for submitting that. In terms of our drought monitor coming out for today, you can see abnormally dry conditions still kind of hugging the east side of the state, particularly through the Sierra and parts of the Oregon-California border. We're actually down a little bit, though, abnormally dry, covering roughly about 7% of the state. We have a little nugget there right towards the southeast corner as well. But in terms of where we were last week at this time, things are improving slightly. We were closer to about 9.5% of the state covered in that abnormally dry yellow category here, that shading last week. And then this week, less drought in the mountains. And that's largely because of these big atmospheric rivers that came through and dumped a lot of snow. They happen to be a little bit colder, whereas some earlier season snow came in and it was slightly higher in elevation. So it just really didn't give us quite the extent of coverage or the type of snow that actually sticks around for quite some time. So we saw roughly about 25% overall gain in the Sierra. You can see the numbers here starting to look pretty good at this point. 82% of average for the northern Sierra, central Sierra at 75% of average, and the southern Sierra about 69%. So that puts our statewide average up to 75%. Much better news compared to what we saw just at the last snow survey, and certainly what we saw at the beginning of the year for that January snow survey. It wasn't looking too good, very thin up there in the high country. And this is really important, too, because as you can see, our precipitation starts to drop off month by month, especially into March and then by April. We can't have what we call a miracle March, where we just get huge atmospheric rivers coming in March. February, though, was a real critical month for us here. Not super critical as in years past because last year was so wet, but all in all, you want to keep that pipeline going periodically. And in terms of our rainfall, too, that's when we start to see things drop off in the month of March. February tends to be one of our wetter months out of the year for downtown Sacramento. And then by the time we get to April, May, and June, there's virtually nothing coming through. And we'll take that all the way through the dry months, which virtually last through September into almost October. That's when we have the peak need for some of our surface water, and that comes from some of that snow melt. Not all of it, but certainly it provides about a third of our water supply. You can see through the month of February, just starting off the month, we've had every day with measurable rain. Some days not so much, other days some pretty decent amounts, but our average to date is 2.5 inches. Normally we have less than an inch, and that 2.5 is closing in on what we almost get for the entire month in just a matter of 7 days. And today, the 8th, looks like we're probably not going to have the measurable rain. So we're getting that much needed break. And it will begin the break that we need for about 7 to 10 days, it looks like. Statewide precipitation, very healthy numbers right here. Unfortunately, it also, with the rain, came at the expense of some hazardous conditions, particularly for Southern California, with mudslides. Had over 400 to almost 500 mudslides in parts of Los Angeles there all the way through Southern California, where unseasonably really wet conditions persisting for Southern California. Starting to see some of those numbers come up here throughout Northern California, which had seen some of the deficits growing. But you'll notice the outlier there, South Lake Tahoe, still about 4 inches behind in total precipitation. Wanted to take a look at some contours here. This is a really beautiful picture provided by the California-Nevada River Forecast Center. And you can see in the month of January, this is where things stood here for the month alone. And the contours are really indicating that we had a drier than average Southern California building up to that point, and also throughout the Sierra. Now, when we just look at February isolated, look at how those numbers change dramatically. Some places 350% of average. And again, we're just in the beginning of the month, nearly just 1 week in, and we're seeing huge gains just from a couple of big storms. That's how critical those storms are for producing some of that precipitation in California. I was able to catch up with Andrew Schwartz. He is out of the UC Berkeley Central Sierra Snow Lab. And one of the things he said is because we're in California, a place where we see extremes in our weather pattern, it's important not to get too tied into those statistical averages.
We're entering that drier time of year here in about 4 to 6 weeks, but that doesn't mean we can't have big storms later on that catch us up.
And that's pretty much what we saw in February. Just a matter of a couple of storms, and look at the dramatic difference. We're talking January 30th. Look at how thin our contours are. Fast forward 2 weeks, and this is where we are today. So positive snow water equivalent gains. I mentioned earlier about how important that snowpack is for our water needs. In fact, it's about a third of our supply. It fills the reservoirs through runoff and other resources that we need. Once we get those positive snow water equivalent gains, then we can use some of that water to replenish our groundwater supply and then also send that water throughout the state. So good news there with our snow water equivalent in the Sierra. Now, that January 30th, an interesting day there because we really turned things around with one storm that kind of opened up the door for some colder conditions to roll on through. Prior to that, we were running about 3 days in a row with record highs, ending on January 30th with downtown Sacramento at 73 degrees, Sacramento Executive 69, Stockton 74, and Modesto at 70. That unfortunately does have an impact on some of that snow because it starts an early runoff into the reservoirs, which makes it a little bit tenuous for water managers to try to play the flood control versus water supply game. In terms of what we're seeing here for our water supply, we're at 125% of historical average for Shasta, 83% full, Oroville 77% full, Folsom at 60% full. When we look at the Central Sierra, New Melones at 83% full, Don Pedro 82 and 62% full for San Luis. That's getting a little bit closer to the coast near the Pacheco Pass. I did want to focus just a moment on Lake Oroville because we were seeing some pretty impressive releases come out of Lake Oroville prior to the series of storms that rolled on through for the beginning of February. Some people were saying, oh my goodness, here we go. They're letting out all of this water for our water supply for the dry summer months. But as you can see, that line here was really starting to move very close to our capacity and certainly well above our average. That's in the teal here. One thing I wanted to point out, if I can, just for a moment and stay on this graphic, is that you'll see this red line right here. Well, that was last year's line as we started to see that water grow in our reservoirs. Keep in mind, prior to last year, we were digging into a really severe drought throughout the state. And then we got this big water year coming in 2022, 2023. The thing with California is a big water year like that can start to carry us through that second year if we don't get the water. That has not been the case this year. And that's why it's been really kind of a game for water managers to try to balance that flood control and water supply. Oroville is our second biggest reservoir in the state. So that's why this one really paints a clear picture here. Here's this blue line right here. That's where we are right now. So they're kind of emptying and letting it fill up, emptying. My guess is that in the coming weeks, they're going to start releasing again. And the reason why is we are starting to see more of a long-term forecast back to a wetter scenario, potentially more of an El Nino type of signature.
There's so many other factors that go into seasonal precipitation and things like that. But of course, the Southern Sierra does benefit from El Nino, and we're starting to see that.
You can see that playing out throughout certainly the entire state of California as we return to a likely wetter scenario when we head into that 8 to 14 day climate outlook. This pattern right here, very similar to what we would normally see in a strong El Nino condition. Now, that's not necessarily a 1-to-1 ratio. Oh, strong El Nino, this is what we'll get. But statistically speaking, Southern California does, in fact, tend to benefit more from a strong El Nino. Not quite as much of a strong signal here through Central and Northern California, but certainly something to watch for Southern California, given all the flooding and the hazardous impacts that we've seen with these past storms that rolled through. Here's a look at the typical El Nino pattern with that extended Pacific jet stream really favoring Southern California in a wetter scenario. Also a warmer setup throughout the Pacific Northwest, which looks likely actually in the next 8 to 14 days. So it looks like we are going to be heading into what would be statistically looking like a very clear El Nino pattern. This will also present some hazardous conditions, potentially looking at the high risk for heavy precipitation throughout the state, extending all the way through parts of the desert Southwest. And then as we look at the snow potential as well, high risk of seeing some of those bigger weather hazards developing throughout the Sierra and parts of the northern end of the state, all the way through the coastal range as well. When we look at wind, of course, we had wide-scale power outages with these last storms that rolled through. Potential for more wind to be a hazard as well. We'll get a big chunk of dry weather, though. That storm track heads well to the north of us, so we have several days here to actually dry out and prepare for this next round of wet weather, which looks like it will be hitting us starting up over the President's Day holiday weekend. Lots of travel throughout the state. It's something we're going to be keeping a very close eye on with our extended forecast right here. We'll keep you updated on how that is going to unfold. We've got a whole weather playlist, by the way, on our ABC 10 Plus app. You want to make sure to download that with in-depth forecasts as well as weather specials like mega flood, water wasted, and our California drought series. You can watch it for free on Apple TV, Roku, and Fire TV. Make sure you download that. And of course, as I mentioned, we will keep you posted on those developing weather changes after this dry stretch back to that wetter scenario.